Today's lecture is going to be on Russian symbolism. While I was researching this, it was interesting how difficult it was to find out any information about it, but after I spent quite a lot of time digging and searching for information, I discovered that this group had a really huge influence on modernism and abstract painting. So Russian symbolism, was a movement of not only fine art, but also literature and all different forms of art, really. The most famous of the Russian poets was Alexander Blok, whose work became very influential during the Silver Age, and in fact the entire Silver Age of Russian poetry is referred to as the Age of Blok. What's noteworthy about his work is that it was very musical and rich in sound. And his later work, he introduced rhythmic patterns and uneven beats. So that was sort of led into the beatnik era that happened later on. The Russian symbolist painters spanned approximately 20 years. And it's divided into two generations, the first generation being 1890 to 1900, and the second generation being around 1900 to 1910. And with the research that I did, I think that there's actually a third generation, which would be 1910 to 1920, though it's totally unofficial that there's a third generation. That's just from my research and seeing that symbolism was being used in that period of time. So the first generation, there's two notable artists that come out, Alexander Binos and Konstantin Somov. And both of these two artists worked with more traditional forms of symbolism and were striving toward more of an aesthetic pleasure. Whereas the second generation were looking for sort of a mystical tone to all of their work. It's important to note that there are two important Russian symbolist painters that spanned both the first and second generation, and those would be Mikhail Rubel, who is considered the most famous of all Russian symbolists, and Mikhail Nesterov. These two painters were the first to incorporate mystical themes, which later became the trademark of the second and third generations of Russian symbolist painters. It's also important to note that Somov's landscape, the Rainbow, sold at Christie's for $7.3 million in 2007, and this was at that time a record amount for any Russian artwork sold in auction. So I've discussed Mikhail Rubel before. As I said, he is considered the most famous of all the Russian symbolist painters. He was loosely associated with the second generation of symbolist painters, though he shared common ground with them, especially with his concentration on supernatural elements in art. Mystical aspects being taken on with increasing significance in Rubel's work, as his paintings maintained a really strong link with the intuitive world outside the frame. In this way, Rubel was breaking from the first generation of Russian symbolist painters whose work lacked a mystical connection. Though there are many paintings that Rubel did that I admire, I'm going to just focus on two for the point of this lecture. Rubel did a lot of work with the theme of the demon, and in Greek the word demon means soul. So what Rubel's really doing with his demon paintings is searching for the inner soul, or his inner soul struggle. In this painting called Demon Seated, Rubel described it as follows: a half-naked, winged, young, moody, and thoughtful figure sits, hugging his knees against the sunset, and looks out at a flowering field, where branches rotting under flowers stretch. Here Rubel poses the question of good and evil, putting forward his ideal of a heroic personality as he saw it, a rebel unwilling to accept the commonplace and unjust nature of reality, tragically alone. Rubel considered a demon to be the soul of a lonely man, reflecting perhaps that he himself was also very lonely. The second painting is called Morning. In this painting, it's a real typical color palette for the Russian symbolist painters, which is cool: blues, violets, greens, and grays. What they're trying to do is stay away from day-to-day life, but more thinking in terms of the mystical, the beyond. Rubel has created a world that is not part of our reality, but is more of one that has a mystical feeling, a feeling of the unknown. He also works with the motif of movement, which was a very big theme for the Russian symbolist painters because they believed that all life had movement. So he also is incorporating rhythmic beats, which the symbolist painters, poets, were doing. He's working with the symbol of water, which refers to the unconscious mind and the world of the unknown. Here, Rubel has created a world where maidens pop up throughout the painting and flowers flow unconnected to any roots, allowing the viewer to float from one element to the next. Here we see a painting by Mikhail Nestorov. Both Rubel and Nestorov liked painting about Russian fairy tales, and which were very popular with the Russian people. And Nestorov was really interested in religious life and religious fairy tales that were in search of the Russian religious ideal. And this was very popular during the time that they were painted with the Russian people. The artist portrays the union between a soul absorbed in spiritual contemplation and the secret nature of untouched civilization. In his painting, Murdered Prince Dmitri, Nestorov presents a humble prayer offered by a meek and ardently soul-seeking prince, touching his heart and looking inward. His work is quiet, soft, and has a very, soft presence to it. He's primarily using a cool color palette, creating a mystical feeling of someone traveling through time, looking into the world of the unseen. It's important to note that after the 1917 revolution, the Bolsheviks banned all religious art, so it forced Nestorov to stop painting these types of paintings, and what he did is he started painting portraits. So the phase that involves the second generation of symbolist painters is referred to as the Blue Rose movement, and it was most active in Moscow during the years of 1904 to 1908. These artists are not only known for their contribution to Russian symbolism, but also for the very evolution of modern Russian painting. The name Blue Rose comes from their one and only group show that took place in Moscow over a 2-month period in the spring of 2007. Visitors to the exhibition were greeted with walls covered with dark gray material upon which the paintings were hung. The floor was carpeted, and there was a scent of flowers in the air, and there was a string quartet that played in the rooms. The art critic McCoskey wrote the following in his review of the exhibit. "The Blue Rose is a beautiful exhibit, a chapel. For the very few, light, quiet, and the pictures are like prayers. When you enter this small chapel, you feel at once that the blue rose is not only a hothouse flower, but also a spring flower of mystical love. Their effect is not outward, physical, but psychological. Narrative is absent, precision of imagery is rejected." The Blue Rose group consisted of 16 artists, and most of them were all friends who went to school at the Moscow Institute of Painting during the early 1900s. They were definitely influenced by Mikhail Rubel's work. He was exhibiting in Moscow during this time period. They also were influenced by a couple of teachers. One was Victor Borisov-Musatov and Valentin Serov. And Borisov-Musatov, I know I'm mispronouncing that, introduced the group to symbolism, first through the European symbolism movement, and then helped with the development of Russian symbolism. And he too became a symbolist painter and contributed to the exhibitions that they did. Valentin Serov helped them understand Impressionism and Russian Impressionism. There was two particular guys in this group, these students, Pavel Kuznetsov, who became the leader of the group, and he was very good friends with Peter Yudkin. Also, Wassily Kandinsky contributed paintings to this exhibition in Moscow, and for their other exhibitions that they had. Though their only one main exhibition was this one that happened in 1907. Conceptually, this second generation of Russian symbolist painters used art as a vehicle to reach the other shore, or the essence, instead of a mere exercise of a particular aesthetic medium, which had been the premise behind the first generation of Russian symbolists. Their youthful energy and desire to experiment possessed the Blue Rose artist and naturally led them to disregard orthodox taste. Another art critic, Nikolai Tarovsky, wrote about their work. An intoxicating vision beckons you into a world of vague outlines, dreams in azure of pale blue and dull serene tones, trembling, unearthly silhouettes, transparent stalks of mystical flowers fanned by the light of dawn, and over all the haze of the unspoken, of that which can be fathomed only by vague presentiment. The very name Blue Rose was in keeping with the ideals of these symbolist painters, for whom the color blue was a symbol of the ulterior world, a higher spirituality. The term Blue Rose had first been used in German symbolist literature to draw on parallels to the delicate female forms that are as subtle as flowers. At that time, a blue rose was non-existent, which embraced the whole concept even further of another dimension of spirituality. So Blue Rose paintings were characterized by a dreamlike, contemplative quality within the context of introspection and an exploration of the spiritual nature of life. The primary aim of the artist was to transcend mundane reality. They wanted to communicate with the beyond or the absolute. And they achieved this through the use of certain symbols such as a woman, babies, fountains, and rainbows. Color was also a very important element to these artists who rejected the warm colors of life and passion in favor of what French symbolist Maurice Denis once described as the elusive distances of cobalt or emerald. In fact, Mikhail Rubel's painting of lilacs, which he did several of them, he used, blue, mauve, and gray tones, and the other symbolist writers referred to that as the poison of Rubel's green, mauve, lilac. I wanted to show you guys this painting by their teacher, Borisov-Musatov, called The Pool. And it's a really interesting painting. First off, we've got the typical color palette of the symbolist painters, the cool blues. But it's also interesting to note that the whole painting has a feeling of the sky, but yet he hasn't painted the sky. He's got the reflection of the sky in a pool, and the painting is called The Pool. And if you look at the two women, the one with the white cape is looking down toward the earth, and then the other woman is glancing upward toward the sky. So this was the artist's way of talking about a mystic detachment, not attached to the earth or not attached to, the heavens, just sort of detached is what he's trying to say here. He's using the pond as a mirror to reflect everything that is around, and yet he's not really painting anything that is a solid subject. He also is a very interesting painter because he uses tempera paint on a really super textured canvas that he hasn't really heavily prepared. So what happens is that this tempera paint absorbs into this coarse canvas and starts to create this tapestry effect, which is quite beautiful when you're up close to it. This artist suffered from a really serious spinal injury and was in a lot of pain for most of his life. And he actually painted, after he painted this painting, he died 2 years later. So we could also kind of think that maybe this artist was reflecting on life itself and what was coming for his future. The Blue Rose painters worked with a lot of symbols of eternity and symbolizing this endless cycle of birth and rebirth. Here we have Kuznetsov, who was the leader of the group, his painting Morning, A New Man is Born. Now he, in this painting, has completely let go of any form of reality or any form, and he's really moving into abstract and going into a deep intuitive place. There's a fountain here that symbolizes the mystical cycle of life, endowed with the spirit of all that exists. He's got a pattern going on with his brushwork that's kind of going downward and creating musical notes, and also looking like a tree or leaves. So it's a double meaning there. You've got fountain spray and tree branches. He's placed a female in the bottom right side of the painting, which is the embodiment of one of their central themes around femininity and eternal femininity with this fountain of life. Now, a number of years later, Kuznetsov's painting was done in 1905, so this was definitely something that was exhibited at their main exhibition in 1907. And then a number of years later, we have this painter, Nikolai Kalmankov, and he's working with the same theme, but in a different way. And the name of this is Artemis and the Sleeping Endymion. We also see the use of water here and the female form, representing eternal femininity. But also for the first time, we see erotic themes, and these were never used before in Russian art, so this is the first time it's being used. He's using a man and a woman intertwined in a circle to symbolize the circles of life. He's using animals and animal patterns to reinforce the primal nature between man and woman. He's using the motif of rhythm to further enhance the symbolism of life. Now this painting, it's interesting to note, was commissioned by Prince Felix Yusupov, and he's best known for masterminding the murder of Rasputin, and I believe he actually was the person who ended up killing him. And this family was a very famous family, and they were wealthier than the czars, so I'm sure this painting was commissioned and hung in their private quarters of their home in St. Petersburg. Now, lastly, I want to touch upon the third generation of symbolist painters with this painting by Nikolai Miloty. This was the development of sound painting, where they're painting to music, and mark making is done primarily with lines. And he's creating a rhythmic pattern here, which is pretty interesting. Now, right along this same time, this was painted in 1912, Kandinsky was also looking at this painting and knew of this artist and was developing his own sound paintings, which he came out with a series called Compositions. Kandinsky's composition paintings were him taking the busy streets of Moscow and breaking them down into abstract line and form. He was working with the concept of music also, and you can also see between these two paintings that there's a lot of similarities with the color palette, and they're moving into some more warmer colors. But the idea of spirituality stays strong between both of these two painters. And after this period, Kandinsky starts writing his essays on the spirituality in art. So by neglecting and even distorting form, as the Blue Rose artists further developed, they liberated art from the rigid demands of realism. Their work injected Russian painting with a new form of dynamicism in their compositions, which later became the hallmark of the Russian avant-garde artist. By abstracting reality, the Blue Rose artist reduced the importance of the concrete object to a bare minimum. Color and line became an expressive force, unprecedented in the history of Russian painting, as the loss of objectiveness was countered by an increase in philosophical and mystical value of their work. It was in their internalization, their transmutation of the object rather than in their rejection of it, that the Blue Rose artists remained profoundly symbolist, or remaining a direct link with the future achievement of the Russian avant-garde.